Going to wait a few minutes to let a few more people join on before we get started here.
Mm-hmm.
Should be live now.
Awesome. Okay. Thank you.
Really?
Thank you everyone for joining. We're just going to wait a few minutes so a few people can hop on before Kylie and I get started this evening.
Mm-hmm.
If you're joining us live, comment below where you guys are joining us from. I would love to see where our attendees are coming from this evening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're already 2 provinces apart. So
yeah,
I'm over on BC, the Chilliwack is where my hometown is, but
yeah, I'm in Saskatchewan, usually in Yorkton, Saskatchewan, where my family farms, but today I'm up in Saskatoon at a conference. So we're covering a few different areas.
Yeah. I think the last time I was in Saskatoon was just before COVID hit, and there was a big horse expo in Saskatoon. So I was there working with a trainer from Alberta, and we had a great time. We really enjoyed Saskatoon. It was great.
Yeah, Saskatoon's a beautiful city. I spent a few years here and recently moved back home. So
yeah,
awesome. Well, let's get started this evening. I just want to welcome everyone to another Talk It Out session. I am Caitlin Kitsan. I am playing Megs today as she's actually in Ottawa testifying. So I'm the Fund Development Manager here with the Do More Agriculture Foundation. Do More Ag is a national voice and champion for mental health in agriculture. Just a few housekeeping items. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat. We want this to be a conversation. So please share any questions you have in the chat and we'll try to get to them all. And tonight I have Kylie with me. I'm really excited to have this conversation with Kylie. So welcome, Kylie, and I'm just going to let you introduce yourself to our group.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks so much for having me, Caitlin. I've been so excited to connect with Do More Ag. As you first find out about someone doing stuff and then you kind of creep the website and read through all the stuff. And it's been so fun being able to partner with you guys and learn more about what you're doing, because being able to create more spaces to talk about mental health in the agriculture community is a really worthwhile endeavor. Farmers and folks are some of the hardest working people I know. And so being able to come alongside them, and I come from a farming background too. So it's a cause that's near and dear to my heart. So with no further ado, my name is Kylie Bartel. I am a registered clinical counselor. So that's a designation that's most commonly used in BC for mental health counselors. And I'm also a Canadian certified counselor, which is just a way of saying to get those designations, you have to have a master's degree in some type of mental health related field. Mine is a master's in counseling psychology, sometimes a master's in social work, or some other degrees will apply for those things as well, or marriage and family therapy. That's kind of the background that comes into it. I have been working, I've done a little bit of work in nonprofits doing wilderness therapy with at-risk youth. And then for the last about 5 years or so, I've been doing private practice, and I do a bit of traditional counseling, but I also do equine and nature assisted counseling. There's something about the folks that don't thrive in a traditional counseling setting, sitting in an office with lots of eye contact, having to be still. I have a kindred spirit resonance with those folks. So it's really fun to be able to take some of the skills, some of the resources that people really need, and put them in a process that also encourages the way their brains work, the way their bodies need to move, and the way that they process best. So a lot of times that looks like going on walk and talk sessions down by the river or through parks. Sometimes it's a mix. Sometimes I meet with people online. Sometimes then we'll do a mixed blend of some online, some out with the horses. And specifically with the horse piece, it's really cool how horses, being herd animals, are very social creatures. They're also prey animals, which makes them very sensitive to stimuli from the environment, and they pick up on vibes and they pick up on tension. And if someone is incongruent, if they're trying to be really still on the outside, but inside their heart is hammering and they have a lot of tension or anxiety, horses will read a lot of the subtle things behind what someone says and open up different opportunities to become more aware of what's happening in our thoughts, what's happening in our feelings, and what's happening in our body. And then have a chance to practice in real time. How do we build more skills for promoting our mental health? So it's a little bit of a different thing for different people, depending on what they're looking for. But that's also one of the parts of my job that I enjoy the most, is being able to hear from someone where they're at and where they want to go, and then customizing a plan that really works best for their strengths and what they're wanting to get out of counseling. And even on this, it's interesting, when I work with some farmers, I do counseling therapy, but I also do a bit of performance coaching, peak performance stuff. I really like studying, how do we do hard things? How do we get in the zone? How do we maximize our productivity and potential? And it's interesting that a lot of those conversations resonate almost a little more with farming folks than maybe some of the challenging or more difficult conversations around mental health. But a lot of times they're all connected, because there's this spectrum where we go from like barely surviving to just being okay. And then we kind of hit like a median. And then how do we go from being okay to really thriving and doing awesome? And that whole spectrum is part of the conversation. So I'll stop there, but that's probably the best nutshell I can give you.
Yeah, I'm really excited to dig into some more of that experience. And the wilderness and the equine therapy is, I totally can see that and how it can help certain people. I know when I moved from the farm into the city for university many years ago now, but, my mental health wasn't at the best state. And I was like, what has changed? And I truly believe I relied a lot on nature. I relied on, my horses. And so
Yeah,
everybody has their own different thing. So
totally.
tonight we're going to mostly focus on trauma and, what is it? How can it impact you? Is it normal for everyone? I've got lots of questions lined up, but if you've got any questions, feel free, to put them in the comments and we'll be watching that. So maybe just to start off, what defines trauma, I guess?
Great question. And I think that's a great place to start, because we want to be able to be clear about what we mean when we say specific words.
Yeah.
So a lot of times I'll differentiate when it comes to trauma. There are big T traumas, like official traumas, and then the little T traumas that are a little bit more relational. They probably wouldn't fit the diagnostic criteria for PTSD in the DSM-5. But interestingly enough, sometimes those small T relational traumas can get us more stuck and caught up than the big ones in some cases. So an example of the little T traumas would be a really difficult breakup, a divorce, maybe a loss of a farm or something like that, maybe a natural disaster, although that one could potentially also be in the big T trauma, because typically a big T trauma is something that is life-threatening to either yourself or someone really close to you. Or they've also noticed, like, if you are a first responder and you're seeing like what they would call, I forget the exact terminology, but things that are life-threatening to other people, often that's sort of the category that we would often look at, or some type of abuse or assault thing that's happening that's really dangerous to a person's physical existence or survival or well-being. Whereas the smaller T traumas tend to be, like even bullying in school might not kill you, but definitely has a really big impact on your emotional well-being in your inner world and how you see yourself. So that's kind of the big T trauma versus the little T trauma. One additional definition I always like to add in there came from one of my professors who specialized in trauma, did a ton of research in it. And his working definition of trauma is simply any experience that is negative and unexpected, that leaves someone feeling confused, overwhelmed, and powerless. So as soon as you start thinking about that definition, it becomes less about like, was the car crash life-threatening or not life-threatening? And it's more about how did the person interpret that experience? Because it's very interesting when we study trauma that two people could be in a relatively similar severity of a car crash, and one walks away and kind of can manage it and process it and continue to move on with their lives, and another person gets either really stuck or really stirred up. So those are the words I'll often use for when people have a traumatic experience and they've experienced it as something that is outside of the realm of normal difficulty. They'll either feel something that we call overly stirred up, which is like hyper aroused. They're kind of flying off the handle. They can't regulate their emotions. They're having panic attacks. That's kind of like shooting above their window of tolerance in hyper arousal, or they're really stuck. They're like hypo aroused. It's like they kind of numb out, they kind of zone out. There's this like, I just can't seem to get past this thing. And a lot of times you might have a bit of both going on. So if those are things happening, chances are there might be something traumatic there, or something that your brain has interpreted as traumatic that might be valuable to process.
Yeah, I really like your second definition, just because, we might have, you and I might go through a similar, situation, but we both will handle that situation differently. And I think everybody handles, every scenario a little bit differently. So, yeah, that was really good. We have our first question that came in. I'm gonna, start with that.
Awesome.
So my spouse and I are going through some heavy personal things at the same time as dealing with the stress of the drought. Instead of dealing with things and trying to decide what he wants to do, he's working excessively hard and very long hours to avoid dealing with it. Any advice on how to cope when someone is avoiding deciding things that you need answers to and will affect your future?
Yeah. The first thought when I hear that question is like, just to take a pause for a second and take a breath, because it sounds like a really hard spot to be in for both parties, right? For the person who submitted the question and the person who's trying their best to cope by throwing their energy into something they can control. So interesting, if we like even apply a definition of trauma to that, something negative and unexpected, a drought, those are negative, and sometimes we see them coming, but it's not maybe expected to be that bad, and leave someone feeling confused, overwhelmed, and powerless. Confused, maybe don't know, maybe not so much confusion with the drought because we're like, oh, the season happened, but overwhelm is what I hear in that. And so a lot of times when we're trying to work with traumatic responses, it's like, what are the corrective emotional experiences in each of those places? So if we feel confused, how do we understand what's happened more? If we are overwhelmed, how do we rally more resources or gain more supports? Confused, overwhelmed, and powerless. So that's the piece where it's like, if I feel powerless in this one area, maybe I'm trying to feel powerful in this other area. And this is one thing that I heard from another professor that I thought was quite good, and it stuck with me. She said, never take away someone's method of coping without trying to offer something of equal or greater value in its place. So there's kind of like it would be tempting in this situation to maybe make a black or white answer of like, either they're distracted and they're avoiding, which is like not helpful, or they're going to come and engage and give me my answer, which would be more helpful. Like kind of like these are the two paths forward. And it's kind of like maybe two things can be true at the same time, that this person is struggling and they're pouring themselves into their work, and we need to find a way to help bring them back online without trying to necessarily criticize that coping that's happening. Maybe it's not the best method of coping, but it is helping in some little way. So this is something that I'll often talk with when it comes to when you have a loved one that's going through some tough stuff. It's like, how do you come alongside them and encourage them as opposed to criticizing them? Because interestingly enough, it sounds like this is like a husband, a wife or a partner who submitted this question for her husband. And there's some really awesome resources from the Gottman Institute, as well as from Emotion Focused Therapy for Couples, created by Sue Johnson, around how these dances that we can get into in committed long-term relationships, we can get into these patterns when we're under stress. And a lot of times we'll notice that one person is kind of like more of the pursuer or the engager. They're the ones that want to tackle the problem head on. And then there might be, it's almost like the yin and the yang. It's like one person who's like, we're good, we're getting after it. And another person that's a little more of a withdrawer, a little more of a space holder. They're the ones that can handle stuff. They don't get as flapped by stuff. They might have tendencies under extreme pressure to be a little more like the ostrich with their head in the sand, but it's not coming from a place of trying to be difficult. It's coming from a lived experience of like, if I just give this enough time and space, it might get better. Whereas a lot of times the pursuer or the engager type has a lived experience of, if I don't deal with this, this is going to go worse. So to make this better, I need to engage. And we can almost end up like with those two extremes pulling ourselves so far apart that we can create, it just can be really a lot of tension and a lot of difficulty. So all of those things to say is that in a marriage relationship, I never want to encourage one partner to be the therapist. I want them to be able to show up as a partner. So that means like you can give feedback and say like, hey, I've noticed that at the end of the day, you're staying out later and we haven't seen you come in for dinner and then we haven't had a chance to talk yet today. So kind of like name the behavior you've seen and then say, I'm concerned that you might be burying yourself in work and there are other things that I really want to be able to talk to you about. And then say something like, are you up to talking about them? Or then it might be a valuable space to loop in some extra help. I don't know if the person would be open to going to therapy, but like have some facilitated discussion where it feels like we can explore some of these pieces in a way where there's some guidance. Because sometimes it's just scary to crack open some of these big discussions and not know not only how we're going to sort out the issue, but also how are we going to talk to each other? How is the conversation going to go? And it's interesting how a lot of times, yes, we need practical answers, but we also take a lot of comfort in feeling the presence of someone that we care about close by. And when there's been a drought or there's been a big catastrophe and we all go into like problem solving mode, we can be like going shoulder to shoulder, checking off boxes without actually feeling like we're really in it together. So I don't know, it depends. Sometimes people feel like the catastrophe brings you closer, but sometimes it also just starts to feel like ships passing in the night where we're not really on the same page and not really connected, which sounds a little more like the case of from this question. So I would, take a big breath. And there's a really good video about the importance of self-compassion, the way we talk to ourselves and the way we model how we treat ourselves in hard things also can set a tone for how we respond and talk to other people in hard things. And there's this, I find with folks in the agricultural community, there's a fine line because if you make it too soft and too fluffy and flowery, they're like, yeah, I'm out. That's not what I don't want to hear that. But I will say there is something about practicing your communication skills so that you can be real and you can be concise and you can be brave because it's freaking scary to sometimes be that vulnerable and that honest. But if we're going to find each other and to get through hard things, I think this is cool. Like, I think that folks in the farming community know this better than anyone. If you need to get all the hay off the field or you need to raise a barn, many, many hands make like work. And it's actually very similar when it comes to emotional burdens and things. Like a lot of times we've got to look and find more ways to turn toward each other. Because the other thing is that sometimes, these big hearts that serve and provide for the community and do all these things, like they're like, well, I don't want to burden the one I love the most with this heavy thing I'm going through. So I'm going to go take it over here and deal with it on my own. And I totally get where that comes from. Speaking to the choir, been there, done it myself. But I remember I came across a quote one time that said, it wasn't fair that we laughed together and then you cried alone. And this whole idea that like, if we're only sharing the good stuff, but then you're isolating yourself in the tough stuff, gosh, that gets heavy really quickly. Like, and I don't actually think that was, it's like why we would have like, I don't know, back in more olden times, you have a plow with 4 horses to go through the easy pasture parts, but then you get to the rocky parts and you like take away most of them and try to go it alone with one. Like it doesn't logically make sense, but somehow we sometimes think that that's going to work better for our emotional problems. So
no, I really like that quote about, we laugh together, but then, we cry alone. Cause I think that happens a lot, right? We always celebrate together, we think, but no, that's really good. So in this, situation, and I hope that, provided them some support to get through what they're going through. But I guess what are we looking for when we think that maybe somebody is maybe going through a traumatic experience or going through a rough time? Like, what are things that we should be looking for? And I know like in this situation, they were excessively working, hardworking.
Yeah.
So what are some other signs? And then maybe just giving a few other, if it wasn't a partner, but a friend or a community, what are other ways to support people?
That's an awesome question. I think, just some signs and things to be aware of if you're kind of wondering if someone's traumatized and if they need help. Like, first of all, the first thing I love to be able to just encourage folks with is to be a little bit aware of like, what's my role in the situation and where's my scope of practice? Like, this idea that, you want to evaluate what is my relationship with this person, like, what is the best way I can serve them? And sometimes it's like, I can do so much as like a spouse or a family member or a friend. And then if it comes to some more severe things like trauma processing or getting a doctor involved or something like that, knowing that the loving thing to do can be encouraging them to seek resources and seek help. Now they don't always choose that, but I do notice I have a really heavy heart sometimes, or I feel the tension for some folks when they're kind of the primary support and they're kind of taking on the job of a counselor without all the training of a counselor and all the resources of a counselor, or a therapist, or there's a couple different people you can reach out for that, even in a medical doctor. Your GP is a great resource for medication when it comes to navigating antidepressants or things in a really heavy time. It can be a really helpful resource to look at. So I'm always like cautious a bit, because I'm like, I could give a lot of tools, but at the same time, it would be sort of like if someone's like, I've got an electrical problem in my barn, I can do a few things here and there. But if I was an electrician coming in and then I gave you a whole, like, this is how you could fix your electrical problem, but I'm an electrician and the other person doesn't have a training as an electrician, it might actually be hurtful if they go in and try to do the depth of work, because I've explained it, but they don't have all the training with it. So I would say, like, there's certain things you can do. There's certain like DIY stuff that you can totally do to make it more helpful. And then know the scope of practice, like know when it's time to call the electrician too. So just have that in mind, because I would never want someone to get in a little deep and get overwhelmed, or have that caregiver burnout that can come for us really easily. Because this is one of the analogies I'll often give people, is that like, I used to be a lifeguard. One of my jobs right out of high school was lifeguarding, and they always would tell us, like, you do not, if someone is drowning and thrashing and flailing, like, you don't jump. Two drowning people is worse than one drowning person. So like, make sure that you're staying safe and that you can help in the ways that also keep you safe, because we got to make sure that we're getting closer to safety, not creating more struggle. So that would be one thought, just kind of off the cuff. And then the other piece, as far as like signs to look out for, that situation sounds like it was kind of an obvious sign, like really burying heavy into work. Like, you're like, this, anytime this behavior is radically inconsistent with like the norm, right? Like, you see an event happen and all of a sudden this person's pattern has changed significantly. That's something to pay attention to. That's for sure a red flag. When it comes to the farming community and anyone in general, but I do notice this a lot with farmers. Sometimes the thoughts or the emotions don't always give us away, but our bodies keep the score. So there's a really awesome book when it comes to understanding trauma, and it's written by a doctor named Bessel van der Kolk, Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, and he wrote a book called The Body Keeps the Score. And it's not a big textbook, it's kind of a paperback book written for the public, and it helps us understand how psychological and emotional trauma will often be stored in the body. And if we don't process it and work with it, it'll often manifest as physical symptoms, or like part physical symptoms. So that's where things like digestive issues can be connected to psychological and emotional distress. Not always, but could be. Lack of sleep, difficulty with sleep, TMJ, migraine issues, teeth grinding, big one. I was like, that one was a huge one when I made the connection of stress, anxiety, and teeth grinding. I was like, oh, okay. So that was one for me personally that was a big light bulb moment. And interestingly enough, if you're grinding your teeth all night while you sleep, your brain doesn't get the opportunity to really get into that deep restorative sleep that it needs. So a lot of folks that I talk to, if they sleep a decent amount, but they still wake up feeling exhausted, that's when I like to check, like, are you a teeth grinder? Is there a way we could use mouth guards or some kind of different thing to try to ease that symptom? Yeah, there's a lot of different physical symptoms that can come out that are connected to that. So if your body is kind of telling you time out, like, I'm out, quit, being able to listen to your body. And I understand, especially for folks in agriculture, it's not as simple as like, well, my body's tired, so I can't do it. And that's not what I'm recommending. It's more about like, do you have a dialogue with your body? So, sometimes I'm all about, even in the performance side of things, like how do we get gritty? How do we dig deep? How do we do hard things? Those are all things I love discussing with folks. But in the same way that like you wouldn't expect the tractor to just keep functioning without proper like oil changes and fuel and maintenance and all the stuff, like that's the kind of stuff I'm talking about when it comes to if you notice things are breaking down with your body or in your relationships too, right? Like irritability can be a real, like the hair trigger quick reactivity on the emotional side of things. Got like, right? Because our bandwidth, it's just like maxed out. Like we just have no more capacity to handle that. So red flag, like, just and notice where those things are coming through. And yeah, thoughts that are either, when it comes to trauma, thoughts that are either abnormally spacey, because a lot of times when we've gone through something hard and we have this feeling of helplessness around it, like we feel powerless, sometimes our brains will just kind of take off. We call it, actually, in extreme cases of trauma, people will dissociate. Like if someone's held at gunpoint and they can't leave, their brain just takes off and it's super adaptive. But that spaciness or that disconnect can be connected to trauma and or hypervigilance. The like, I need to be on top of every detail, that like overarching and quite tense response to trying to dig into every detail and get it perfect, can kind of be the two sides of those. So anytime I'm evaluating someone or kind of assessing or exploring with someone, have they been traumatized by what they've been through? Usually I'm exploring on 3 levels, being what's happening on your thoughts, in your mind, what's happening in your emotions, in your heart, and what's happening somatically in your body. Are you like getting shortness of breath that are related to panic attacks? Are you, muscle tension or aches and pains and things like that seem just, when you map out the timeline, you want to be aware of that. And one last note I'll add that just made me think of as I assess those things on like the thoughts, the emotions, and the body somatic side of things. The body keeps the score and will often remember anniversaries of trauma, interestingly enough. So I was pretty closely connected to a number of folks who got hit really hard by the flooding in BC 2 years ago in the Lower Mainland. And it was interesting the following year when the season started to change again, and everyone was like, I'm actually like, I objectively am doing okay, but all of a sudden I can't sleep anymore. And when the rain hits, like whenever we go through something traumatic, our brain starts taking a very clear high def video of everything that's going on in our senses, what we see, what we smell, the temperature in the air, what we feel, how dark or bright it is, what we taste, like all the pieces, even to the point where for car accident victims, when you look to the left and the car hits you, in a therapy session, we can actually use eye movements to bring up a little bit of that distress by taking your eye to the place it went when the trauma happened, and then helping process that and take the intensity out of that to try to come and move through that. That's from a therapy. It's a little bit similar to EMDR, but it's also called OEI. Those stand for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing therapies, which are very designed for trauma processing, PTSD, all that kind of stuff. So all that to say, our bodies are very aware. And when that emotional heightened, like that emotional intensity comes up of a trauma response, our bodies hit record and go, this almost got me. And then if this ever starts to feel like this is happening again in the future, I'm going to be on high alert so that it doesn't happen again. So that's why triggers happen the way they do. So if people are getting triggered emotionally or whatever is going on, again, definitely things to consider, and things that could be helped a lot by counseling or therapy or supports, or just having some more strategies and resources for coping with some of those symptoms. Yeah.
I want to touch on that point, but before I do, just a reminder, if you have any more questions, please put them into the chat. We are going to be wrapping up here pretty quickly. So just kind of last reminder, put your questions. I know Kylie would love to answer them here live. But back on like the anniversary. So my next question was going to be, can trauma, is it normal to process it later? So, maybe just talk a little bit about that. I know you touched on it a lot, but sometimes I know personally you don't realize, and then months or years later. But so
Mhm.
yeah, if you want to talk about how we maybe process it a little bit later.
Yes. Oh, that's a fantastic question. And I think that it's interesting because I do see uh, the only pattern is that there's no clear pattern. Like everyone tends to process it in their own timing. And that's where, from a therapist perspective, I always work very collaboratively with people. But yeah, like sometimes a trauma can happen. It's an acute event. And someone's like, I know this really like messed me up and now I'm all rattled and I want to come in and process it. And they do the work pretty quickly. Other times, if something bad has happened and there are no resources, there just isn't enough time and energy to deal with it, our bodies and our brains will sort of lock it in a box and maybe stick it in the basement of if our inner world is like a house, you kind of lock that away in a corner and you just have to get on doing whatever you need to do. And that's where um, I never judge or criticize anyone who's in that boat because it's kind of like that was the best you could do at the time. Um, and so it's interesting though, whether you have a spiritual perspective on it or just the way you see the world, it's interesting that a lot of times these things will come back to us at the times that we might be able to process them. Like I'll notice even for someone who's maybe gone through a really difficult breakup or relationship ending or something, and then in the aftermath, they don't have the capacity to really process, but they need some more safety and stability. So this is probably a good comment towards this. The three main phases of trauma processing, whatever therapy you end up doing, is stage one is just safety and stability. Do you have enough safety and stability to go in there and do some processing? Because if you don't have that, it would be like someone being in a massive car accident, coming into the ER, and then the doctor goes, you need surgery, but the surgery you need right now to save your life is actually going to kill you because your body has been through so much. So what do? They put you in a coma or they put you in some type of state where your body can like acclimatize and stabilize. So it would actually be unethical to whip you right into surgery because you don't have the stability to survive the surgery you need. Does that mean you don't need the surgery? No, that does need to come later, but that first stage of safety and stabilization is crucial. And it's really important. So as soon as you can do that, and sometimes that safety and stabilization phase takes months, it can take a year or two, or because stabilization requires some environmental predictability and supports. And can we control those things? A lot of the times, no. So a lot of times when people are in acute crisis, we do what's called a wraparound process to try to like name all the different resources and different social supports and community supports and religious supports if that's part of their worldview or whatever, and just trying to find different ways to bring in stability enough so that we can then have a more intentional conversation about where we go from here. But safety and stabilization is phase one. Phase two would be the trauma processing, figuring out what happened and figuring out those how can we create some corrective emotional experiences so that if people felt powerless, how do we help them feel powerful? If they felt confused, how do they start to make sense of things? And if they felt overwhelmed, where do they rally and get the backup that they needed? And then the third phase of trauma processing would be how do we take the insights that we've created in the therapy room and bridge them to life outside of the therapy room? Because it can be one thing to sit on a couch and be like, oh, okay, I get why that messes me up every year. And it's another thing to figure out the skills that you need to manage it and to walk through that anniversary or that space. And oh, I really feel for farming folks because a lot of times when they're trying to tackle trauma, I'll often notice that it's not just a work thing because a lot of times our families and our work are so closely connected, which kind of makes it a little bit, it's like there's a pro to that in the sense that like you get to see your family more. And when things are good, you get to celebrate those wins together and you have so much connection. But when things are bad, it'd be different than maybe someone who worked at a bank and had a difficult like experience at work, but then they get to come home and it's separate and it's disconnected. And the brain finds all these different ways to connect. So being able to know that sometimes we don't have the safety and stabilization to really turn towards the trauma and work on it. So whether you're pursuing safety and stabilization with a therapist or on your own on your own volition. There's a lot you can do on your own in that aspect for sure. I really I admire folks actually that come in and say like, this thing happened a while ago and I thought I was okay with it, but it just keeps kind of getting that, like, it's almost like I pulled the weed out and I got most of it, but there's a root still down in here, and every spring something keeps popping up and I'm like, okay, well, you could keep pulling it off and getting the top part of it, but maybe there's a different tool we could use here. Maybe there's a different resource. Maybe we find a rototiller for that part of the garden or something, right? Like, or, but it's so crazy how many metaphors from agriculture and farming work on the mental side of things. And I chuckle because a lot of times I talk to people who aren't in agriculture and that makes sense to them. But then I'm like, oh, it's even better when that actually can be a practical analogy or metaphor, if you will. So yeah.
No, I think we all enjoy your farming metaphors. It helps relate it a lot better because I think about me pulling my weeds and I only get the top and I'm like, why does this keep coming up? And definitely relate on that one.
Yeah.
You've left us with so many takeaway points. And, I think for me, it's really like trauma looks different for everyone. Everybody reacts to it differently. Everybody needs different types of support. And for that person on the other side, maybe, supporting within your means or, supporting within your scope of work, your scope of area. And, if you're a doctor of education, I probably don't want you to be doing heart surgery on me, right? Like
Yes.
and it's understanding that we all have a role to play for sure, but understanding that role and then also being that connector, being that bridge for that additional help. So I just want to thank you, Kylie. This was like a great conversation, a great way to end my day, I know. And I just want to encourage everyone that if, we've got lots of resources and support on our Do More website. So you can visit it at domore.ag. I also want to encourage everybody to sign up for Ag Talk. And we launched Ag Talk in June, and it's a great digital platform where you can go if you need support. But maybe if you don't need support right now, I still want you to, join and be that support for someone else. Because you never know when you're going to need that support back. So just want to thank Kylie for joining us this evening. And and thank you everyone who tuned in live. And this will be on our YouTube after tonight.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for having me. Again, I am so I actually only discovered Do More Ag recently, and I was like, how have I not known about this longer? And it's just so cool to see the different things coming together. So please continue to do what you guys are doing. And to any folks out there where if this stuff resonated with you, maybe I'll leave this little nugget as our takeaway. When they studied PTSD and figured out who people would go through traumatic experiences, and some people developed PTSD and some people didn't, and they figured out like what was the difference. And there are a couple different factors, but one of the key factors for people who didn't develop PTSD after going through a traumatic event were the people who were willing to stay connected in community and ask for help. Which is crazy because it had nothing to do with like their mental toughness or the severity of the situation. It had everything to do with a skill. Granted, it's vulnerable to ask for help for sure. And I would also add, like, you can choose who you let in, because that's fair. You don't have to just let anyone in, but staying connected in community and asking for help, huge resiliency factors against developing PTSD. So super cool that that's basically like the mission of Do More Ag as an organization. Just really cool that you guys are spot on. And thank you so much for what you do.